everybody should get this book. Everybody should read this book. The Ganja Complex, Rastafari and Marijuana by Ainsley Hamid. Ainsley Hamid is one of the foremost scholars on drug markets, drugs, socially. He is an ethnographer, former ethnographer at CUNY John Jay. And he did this ethnographic study of outgroup males, dispossessed males in the Caribbean post Hart-Celler Immigration Act of 1965. Hart-Celler Immigration Act of 1965 essentially opened up the borders for non-white persons in the United States. Prior, there was quotas, and it was mostly Europeans coming into the United States. So what happened in this, after the Hart-Celler Immigration Act, a lot of parents came up to the United States. There was stagflation in the 70s, and the remittances that they thought they were going to be able to send home, they weren't able to. And many of these new post-colonial governments, they wanted to be conservative, and not saying pushing education is a bad thing, but if you weren't doing good in school, there were a lot of, it led to a lot of vagrant youth, and these youth ended up in prison. And in this book, it says that once these youth ended up in prison, what was happening in the prisons in the Caribbean in late 60s, early 70s was the Black Power movement. And Rastafari was an integral part of that. So they buck up on the Ras. And it says youth that were hell-bent on revolution, committing petty crimes, drinking alcohol, and overthrowing the government, they found Rastafari, found marijuana, and became astute businessmen, began reading scholarly books along with the Bible, and became successful paterfamilias. A paterfamilia means male head of the household. So essentially, this book shows how ganja take vagrant youth and make them men. That's in multiple aspects. And it shows, he follows these, so he goes to San Fernando in Trinidad. He follows many of these young men up to the United States, and they land in Brooklyn, and they begin illicit ganja trade. In the book it says, and he talks about the different cannabis markets in New York City. So he goes back and he talks about, in Malcolm X's autobiography, Malcolm X talks about how he used to sell to jazz singers, and we mentioned jazz in the Howell connection also. So you see everything still coming back. But Malcolm said, and this was when he was Detroit Red, but in Malcolm's autobiography, if you go back, he said when he was selling loose reefer sticks, he said it was the first time that he felt like a man, because this gave him autonomy, get to do what he wanted, set his own standards, his own rules. So it's easy to see how this new economy would cause these young men to become paterfamilias, male head of households. And he mentions also Claude Brown's Man Child in the Promised Land, about where Claude Brown mentions about reefer selling in Harlem. But what Hamid says is that Afro-Caribbean youth came to New York City and fortified a market that already African-American youth and Latino youth were selling in. So basically, they came in and brought reinforcements and fortified the ganja market. So it says in the 1970s, they had a good thing going in the 70s. They were able to reinvest in their communities. That's one of the things that the MRTA, the bill that was passed, the cannabis legalization for adult use that was passed last year, March, calls for community reinvestment. These young men were reinvesting their illicit funds in their communities, opening schools, opening ITIL shops. I speak about this often at different conferences and talks that I give. Hamid talks about how, well, Hamid talks about it, but I know that there are many, like there's a thrust of everybody's vegan now. But before there was vegan, there was ITIL. So essentially the first vegan shops was brought to you by way of illicit ganja. You feel me? And that is important. That is something we need to shout from the mountaintops. But it wasn't only ITIL shops. It was schools. It was houses, it was remittances back home. It was fortifying their community as well as the African American and Latino community. And Hamid has data on this also. But a funny thing happened on the way to the forum. In the 1980 election, Ronald Reagan is running for president. And he says that marijuana is potentially the most dangerous drug in the nation or in the world or something like that. And this is when he begins his eradication of the ganja fields in all over Grenada, St. Vincent, Guyana, Jamaica. Whoever was growing, they was coming in. And in Casey Jean McCullough's book, The CIA Secret War in Jamaica, in this book, in the Ganja Complex, Hamid talks about how when Reagan declares marijuana public enemy #1 or what have you, Seaga comes up to the White House or meets with Reagan or calls him and tells him, he's like, hey, listen, this ganja thing is my country's #1 export and it's illegal. It's sustaining my country. You can't do this. But we know what happened. He did it. During the 80s was a time when the United States was also involved in the Iran-Contra affair and fortifying governments that were essentially narco states. So long story short is whilst the United States, CIA, FBI, DEA, ATF were fulfilling the war on drugs on one hand, eradicating ganja farms. On the other hand, CIA Special Ops can neither confirm or deny that they was fortifying governments to traffic cocaine into the United States. So Hamid says that this essentially gave, I could read some excerpts from the book, right? Yeah, since I'm telling the story. So this is from chapter 6, The Ganja Complex in Brooklyn, the rise and fall of the marijuana complex and the advent of cocaine. One second. So right here, it says, finally, marijuana revenues were spent on a weekly newspaper and 2 schools, one of which remains in operation and is a top ranked among Brooklyn primary schools. Reggae bands were sponsored, tuition for Rastafari women who studied nutrition, seamstressing, or education were paid. The marijuana economy demonstrably restored vitality and prosperity to neighborhoods which had suffered disintegration on account of modernization and development initiatives. Embittered relationships among the young distributors and users were healed. A new religion enfolded them, while the relationship between them and their parents improved, while marijuana revenues bought mom and pop stores and other property for the latter. So that's the marijuana economy. So after Reagan did all that, it says here that It was as neighborhoods of apartment buildings throughout minority Brooklyn and the city suffered greater decline that marijuana was replaced by. So you see, it's always, so I'm not here to bad talk any type of single standalone substance that is not psychoactive by itself. I'm not here to bad talk cocaine, I'm not here to bad talk crack, I'm not here to bad talk heroin, I'm not here to bad talk ganja, because they're all standalone substances that can be psychoactive when combined with the human body. So prior to crack cocaine, you had, I spoke about this on another podcast, you had benign neglect, you had urban blight, you had planned shrinkage, you had the taking away of resources, you had an increase in unemployment rate for young black men. The unemployment rate for young black men is always recessionary. So when we have a recession, when people are out of work, that state is like that for young black men. And then this new wave came in, and it says it was as neighborhoods of apartment buildings throughout minority Brooklyn and the city suffered greater decline that marijuana was replaced by cocaine hydrochloride powder. And my man Underhill Ave Flea, he has a documentary coming out called Underhill Ave, and he talks about, he actually has some documented persons talking about the changeover from the ganja economy and how the cocaine substances came in as marijuana distributors were drawn into experimentation with cocaine distribution and use. The important function they had served as preservers of real estate and other things were lost, right? The substitution of marijuana by cocaine offers further superlative proof of the argument that drug prohibition approaches to the drug problem, interdiction, crop substitution, street level enforcement, all those things that the drug war did only make matters worse. That's what we know today. The war on drugs is an abject failure. Even in the rare instances when they happen to be successful, drug prohibition damaged marijuana distribution, but the end result brought about in the context of urban decline was to deliver the users to cocaine. You feel me? So that's how the economy changed over. Dr. Hamid, as well as Dr. Carhart, have done some fascinating studies on drugs on the brain, drugs on people, and drugs on, well, persons using cocaine. And both have found that it's not as addictive as people say. So I urge everyone to look at their studies, and their studies always tie back into other social determinants of health that was happening around during what we call the crack cocaine epidemic. In fact, Hamid, it's funny, Hamid, what a lot of people know Dr. Carhart. Dr. Carhart is the professor, Aras too, that he teaches at Columbia. He wrote two books. He wrote High Price and Drug Use for Grown-Ups. And I believe in Drug Use for Grown-Ups, he talks about how he was an active heroin user. You heard about him? Yeah, he said he actively used heroin to self-medicate, to essentially show that it's not addictive, like there's function in what we call, I move away from that terminology, addicts. But yeah, they've done some, so Hamid had done these studies before. But people need to look up Hamid and then get back to me on the next interview, and then we could talk more about Hamid. But yeah, he's a real deal.
Well, let me hear you say, Mount